David never thought a single moment could rattle the delicate peace he had cultivated within his own home. For years, he had managed a careful balance, father by day, and occasionally, in the stillness behind his locked office door, the figure he called Diane by night. He never expected anyone to see him in that floral sundress, certainly not his 19-year-old son, Leo. And yet here he was, the faint hum of the air conditioner in the hallway broken by the sound of Leo's gasp. The look on Leo's face threw David's world into chaos. He had been so sure he locked the office door. That was always the first thing he did before heading to the makeshift vanity in the corner, a relic of the previous homeowner that David had repurposed for his quiet getaways. In that small space, he would lay out his makeup kit next to a small mirror, carefully selecting each product. The gentle routine calmed him: primer, foundation, eyeshadow in soft, natural shades, a single coat of mascara. Sometimes he went for lip gloss. Other times, he allowed himself a deeper shade of lipstick, a color that made him feel both comfortable and oddly courageous. Afterward, he would slip into garments he'd picked out with care, always tasteful, never too flashy, always comforting in the way they made him feel light and unburdened. He had been in the midst of touching up his eyeliner when he heard the doorknob turn. Time froze. He remembered thinking, "No, it should be locked." Then the door opened. The click of the latch was the only sound in the still air as Leo peeked in, presumably to ask about some homework question. Their eyes met. David could see Leo's gaze slowly flick from the wig perched on David's head to the hem of the sundress that skimmed just above David's knees. A hush settled between them for a heartbeat. Then, shock registered on Leo's face. Before David could even stand up or say a single word, Leo stepped back and shut the door with a force that rattled the window. In the silence that followed, David felt as though every passing second was an eternity of dread. His heart pounded so hard he expected to see the movement beneath the floral pattern on his chest. His breath felt trapped in his lungs, and his reflection in the mirror only magnified the panic. Here he was, a grown man in a soft green sundress with pink daisies, a style that someone else might have worn to a picnic on a warm summer day. Mascara and eyeliner framed his eyes. A wig of shoulder-length hair completed the look. He realized with sudden horror that there would be no easy way to explain this away as a prank or a joke. He stood motionless, arms at his sides, unsure whether to run after Leo or bury himself in that office forever. Eventually, he mustered the will to leave the office. He took the wig off in a clumsy rush and set it on the desk, then kicked off the modest flats he had been wearing. He quickly changed into sweatpants and a t-shirt, wiping his face with makeup-removing wipes until the skin felt raw. Even with the outward transformation undone, he could still feel his heart thundering. When he finally opened the office door, he noticed that Leo's bedroom door was shut. A tense quiet saturated the hallway. David walked over and raised his hand to knock, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. Instead, he pressed his forehead gently against the door. "Leo," he said softly, but no reply came. He waited for what felt like a very long time, hoping to hear any rustle of movement, any sign that Leo would let him speak. The hallway remained silent. Shaken, David retreated to the living room. The house had rarely felt so oppressive. The furniture, the photos on the walls, the overhead light, everything seemed too bright and yet too heavy, pressing in on him. David slumped onto the couch, pressing the heels of his hands against his eyes, as if that could make the memory vanish. He could still picture the stun in Leo's wide eyes, the unspoken questions, the confusion. For Leo to find him dressed in that way, someone who was more than just dad, was never part of any plan. After all these years, David had kept this side of himself strictly private. It was a refuge from stress, a quiet corner of his life he'd built as a way to find calm in the midst of single fatherhood, paying bills, and living up to the memory of an ex-partner who had long ago left the picture. Minutes crawled by. Eventually, David forced himself to stand. He left the living room and walked into the kitchen, where he mindlessly began to prepare dinner. He turned on the faucet to rinse some rice, then set a pot to boil. He sliced a few vegetables, his motions mechanical and his mind elsewhere. He replayed the scene in his head over and over. Leo's expression, that flinch of surprise, the door slamming. David kept thinking, how do I even talk about this? How do I find the words? He set the table for two, just as he always did, but he knew this dinner would be no simple father-son chat. After a while, he heard Leo's door open. David's chest tightened. He quickly placed 2 plates on the table, trying to appear casual. Leo emerged from the hallway. His eyes looked puffy, though David couldn't be certain if it was from tears or just the aftershock of what he'd seen. David started, pressing his lips together as though searching for the most precise, least frightening words. Dinner's ready if you want some. Leo stood at the edge of the kitchen, hands in his pockets. He usually shuffled in wearing headphones or an old sweatshirt, sometimes joking that he was too tall for the kitchen's low-hanging lamp. Now he had none of that casual air. Shoulders rigid, gaze darting around, he looked like he was trying to avoid eye contact altogether. After a few seconds, he nodded slightly, pulled out a chair, and sat without a word. David sank into his own chair. The table felt massive between them, the silence even larger. He cleared his throat. So, do you want to talk about what you saw? Leo shook his head, still looking at his plate. Not really, he said quietly. David exhaled. I understand this must be confusing. Silence. But I need you to know, you can ask me anything. David pressed on, though he could feel the cracks in his own voice. I'm sorry you had to find out like this. It wasn't planned. I forgot to lock the door. Leo lifted his head slightly, glancing at his father. There was a swirl of emotion in his eyes, hurt, confusion, maybe betrayal. His voice trembled, but he spoke carefully, as if choosing each word with precision. Dad, were you wearing a dress? David's pulse quickened. Hearing it asked so plainly was jarring, but it was a question that demanded honesty. Yes, he said, bracing himself for the flood of follow-ups. It's something I do sometimes, but I've never let anyone else see me. Leo's gaze dropped back to his plate. Neither father nor son seemed to have an appetite. Eventually, Leo pushed his plate away. I'm not hungry, he said. He left the table, heading back to his room, leaving David staring after him. That night, David barely slept. He lay on his bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment in his mind. He kept wrestling with the same dread. Will Leo ever look at me the same way again? How do we move on from this? The next morning, the house was wrapped in the hush of a tense standoff. David poured himself coffee and peered at the clock on the microwave. Soon, he heard Leo stirring. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made David's stomach tighten, but he forced himself to speak when Leo passed by. Good morning, he said gently. Leo paused, half turning. He still looked haunted by what he had witnessed, but he muttered, Morning, before stepping into the kitchen to grab a granola bar. His hair was a bit messy. Dark curls fell across his forehead, and faint circles under his eyes hinted that his rest had been as troubled as David's. He gave the smallest nod to David, then walked off with the wrapper and retreated to his room once more. David took a long sip of coffee, telling himself that it would take time for Leo to process this. It would be difficult enough for any child to see a parent in an unfamiliar light, but for them to see a father dressed in women's clothes added layers of questions David could barely begin to answer. He told himself he had to find the courage to speak to Leo again, thoroughly and with patience, to address every question. Rehearsing the conversation in his head, David found no perfect script. That afternoon, David decided to stand outside Leo's door again. Enough was enough. He had to try. He raised his knuckles to knock, and this time he actually did it. A muffled voice from inside answered. "Come in." David turned the handle and stepped inside. The room was lit by a desk lamp, a small clutter of textbooks on top of the desk. Leo sat on the bed, phone in hand, but he set the phone aside as soon as his father entered. David closed the door behind him gently. "Can I sit?" David asked, gesturing to the desk chair. Leo nodded. "Yeah." David sat, resting his hands on his knees. "I'm sorry you had to find out that way," he began. "I never intended for you to see me in that outfit." Leo swallowed. "Why do you do it?" His voice shook slightly, as though he was uncertain whether he really wanted an answer. The simplest and truest response David could find was this: "It's something that helps me relax, helps me feel less of the everyday pressure. I started doing it years ago, but I've always kept it private." He paused, gathering a few more words together. "I don't want to be dishonest with you. I'm just not sure how to talk about it." Leo's brows drew together. "So, is this something you do because you—" He trailed off, clearly fumbling for the right language. "Like, are you trying to be a woman?" The question shot straight through David, as he had considered the complexity of that question for as long as he had stepped into the persona of Diane. He shook his head, exhaling. "I'm still me. I feel comfortable dressing that way sometimes, but it doesn't change who I am as your dad. It doesn't take away from how much I care about you or how I handle our lives. It's just a part of me I usually keep to myself." Leo chewed his lower lip, an old, nervous habit. "You're the only parent I have." He sounded almost defensive, as if bracing for something. "It's just weird." "I know," David said, his own voice barely above a whisper. "I can't pretend it's not a shock for you. I should have found the courage to mention it in a gentle way, but I never wanted to burden you with something that I thought was my own personal escape." He rubbed his temples. "It's not that I'm ashamed. I was just afraid of what you'd think." For a moment, neither said anything. David could feel tension in the air like a thick fog. Finally, Leo cleared his throat. "I thought maybe you didn't trust me," he said. "Like you were keeping secrets." "I never meant for you to feel that way," David said softly. "I do trust you. It's just complicated, and it's hard to explain because it's not exactly common. People might misunderstand, and I didn't want you to suffer any weird looks if you told someone, though I'm not saying you would have. I didn't want that to fall on you." Leo nodded slowly, as though weighing David's words. "So you're not embarrassed?" David smiled sadly. "I was at first. When you walked in, I panicked. I've spent so long hiding that side of me. But am I embarrassed of who I am deep down? No. I do feel uncomfortable that it caused you distress." Leo slumped back onto the bed, staring at the ceiling. For a moment, he looked younger than his 19 years. That same childlike vulnerability from years before flickering across his face. "I guess I'm worried. Does this mean you're going to be different?" The question was heartbreakingly direct. David shook his head, voice firm. "No, I've always been this person. I just kept some of it away from you. Maybe now you'll see a bit more of me if you want to. But I'm still your father who watches soccer with you tries to help with your classes, and bugs you to take out the garbage." He offered a small, tentative smile. Leo let out a breath that sounded like a mixture of relief and lingering anxiety. "It's just going to take time to get used to," he admitted. "I don't want to see you differently, but it's hard to forget. I walked in and saw you. You looked so comfortable in a weird way." David's cheeks warmed. "It does make me feel at ease. I hope you can understand that. But I'm here to answer any questions you have. And if you need space, that's okay too." Leo nodded, sitting in silence for a moment. "I appreciate you telling me," he said eventually. "I'm still kind of freaked out, but I'll try to talk about it, I guess." David felt a wave of relief wash over him, but he knew this was only the beginning of a longer journey for both of them. "Thank you," he said, pushing himself up from the chair. He moved to the doorway, pausing. "I'm thinking I'll order takeout tonight. Maybe we can watch something together?" Leo let a tiny smile tug at his lips. "Sure," he said. "I'd like that." The next few days were filled with a quiet, cautious normalcy. David went to work at the local accounting firm, diligently plugging away at spreadsheets and returning client calls. Leo attended his part-time college courses, juggling a dense reading list with lingering questions about his father that he couldn't quite articulate. They would come together in the evening, share a meal, and watch a show. Conversation about what happened was minimal, but a mutual understanding hung in the air. They weren't ignoring it. They were just giving themselves time to process. David, meanwhile, debated about whether to store away all of Diane's items for a while. Out of sight, out of mind. But he recognized that ignoring it wouldn't help. He instead decided to keep them in the office closet, neatly folded and organized. Occasionally, when he felt the daily weight pressing on him, he'd consider slipping on that floral sundress or brushing on a bit of eyeshadow. But he would stop himself, reminding himself that Leo might still be grappling with the new reality. Pressuring him to be okay with everything too soon felt wrong. Yet David also couldn't deny the comfort he found in those clothes. The way each outfit or subtle bit of makeup reminded him that life's pressures could be softened, even if only for an hour at a time. One afternoon, a small turning point arrived. Leo came home earlier than usual, dropping his book bag at the door. David was in the kitchen, cutting up vegetables for soup. Leo walked in, glancing at the cutting board. "Need any help?" he asked. David blinked, a bit surprised. It had been a while since Leo had offered to help with cooking. "Sure," David said, stepping aside. "You can slice up the carrots if you want." Leo washed his hands at the sink, grabbed a knife, and started chopping. For a few minutes, it was just the rhythmic sound of the knife on the board. Then Leo spoke up, not meeting David's eyes. "So, do you have a name for yourself when you're dressed like that?" David paused. He set down the onion he was about to chop. "I call myself Diane when I'm in that outfit," he said quietly. "I guess I liked how it sounded." Leo gave a nod, the corners of his mouth twitching in what might have been a faint smile. "Diane," he repeated. "That's a nice name." "Thank you," David said, relieved that Leo hadn't attached mockery or resentment to it. He watched Leo's knife carefully, stepping in just to show him the right way to hold it so that the slices were neat. They went back to chopping. A few more minutes passed, and then Leo said, "So, do you ever go out like that? Do you ever go outside?" David shook his head. "No, I've always just done it in the house, mostly in my office behind a locked door. I never wanted anyone else to know." Leo looked over, brow creasing. "Would you want to? If you could?" David hesitated. He'd asked himself that question many times before. "I'm not sure," he answered honestly. "I think a part of me is curious about that, but I've never felt safe enough. It's hard to predict how people would react. I was and still am, worried about how it could affect you." Leo processed that quietly. They finished slicing the vegetables and set them aside. As the soup cooked, an aroma of warm spices filled the kitchen, offering a sense of comfort that David hadn't felt since that day Leo discovered Diane. Over dinner, Leo asked more questions. None felt accusatory. They were simply the queries of a young man trying to understand. "When did you start?" "Is this something you did before I was born?" David explained as openly as he could, that it had started in his early 20s, well before Leo was around. It was an occasional release from stress, something he could do that made him feel a sense of calm and wholeness he found nowhere else. He had never told Leo's mother, and by the time the relationship ended, Diane had become something of a best-kept secret. Over the years, it was easier for David to keep that persona hidden rather than risk confusing or alienating his son. Leo listened, not always meeting his father's eyes, but nodding at appropriate moments. He asked how often David became Diane, whether it had changed the way David saw himself. David explained that, deep down, he felt that wearing those clothes didn't replace who he was, but allowed him a mental space free from the typical constraints of fatherhood and adult responsibility. By the time they finished dinner, a gentle closeness had reemerged. They cleared the dishes together, and while they didn't share easy banter, the sense of collision that had rocked them both was beginning to settle. As the days turned to weeks, the father and son navigated this altered reality bit by bit. The tension no longer dominated every interaction, though Leo would occasionally get a distant look, as if recalling the sight of his father in that sundress. Sometimes David would catch that flicker of disquiet in Leo's eyes, and he would ask, "You okay?" Leo would usually nod and give a small smile, and sometimes it would be David who needed a moment to collect his thoughts as he wrestled with how much he should reveal and how often he should keep Diane's appearance under wraps until Leo felt more at ease. One evening, Leo came out of his room wearing a mix of frustration and nervous energy on his face. David recognized that look. Leo had it whenever a big decision or a daunting assignment loomed. David turned off the TV. "Something on your mind?" Leo fidgeted, pushing his hands into his pockets. "Yeah, actually, I have a bunch of homework to do, but also, I was thinking..." He paused, swallowing. "Maybe we could talk some more about this Diane thing." David motioned for him to sit on the couch. The father muted the television, giving Leo his full attention. "Sure," he said, bracing himself. Leo took a moment. "I remember, after Mom left, you used to be so stressed. Like, you'd stay up late doing laundry or going over finances. You'd get this look on your face like you had the weight of the world on your shoulders. So, is that when you started really doing this more often?" David smiled ruefully. "Yes, around that time. Life piled up. Your mother's absence left me raising you alone, and I felt I had to be strong. But it was tough. Dressing the way I do gave me, well, relief in a sense. Whenever I was Diane, I could forget the heaviness for a while." Leo nodded slowly, letting that sink in. "I guess it's just weird, because I keep thinking about all the times I was hanging out with friends, or I was in my room playing video games, and you were in your office, maybe wearing a dress, and I had no clue." David shrugged, trying to keep a gentle tone. "It probably happened more often than you realize. But Leo, I was still your dad, even when I had heels on in my office. My love for you, my responsibilities, my sense of humor, none of that was replaced by a pair of shoes or a bit of makeup." Leo let a small laugh slip out. "I guess so. I never noticed any difference when you came out of your office. You'd just remind me to finish my assignments or help me study." "That's exactly it," David said. "Nothing changes for me as a parent." Leo's face twisted in a storm of expressions: relief, embarrassment, curiosity. "Could I see it again?" he finally asked, voice barely above a whisper. David felt his heart rate spike. "What do you mean?" Leo rubbed his neck, blushing a little. "I mean, you told me you felt calmer when you're Diane. Maybe if I see it in a more controlled way, like if I'm prepared, if I know you're going to come out dressed like that, maybe it'll help me stop picturing that moment where I walked in unannounced." David let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. "Are you sure?" Leo nodded, though apprehension flickered across his features. "I think so. I don't want to pretend it doesn't exist. I'd rather deal with it head on." "All right," David said gently, "but not tonight. Let's pick a day when we're both comfortable. No pressure, okay?" Leo let out a relieved breath. "Okay." They tentatively decided on the coming Saturday afternoon when both had free time. David spent the rest of the week in a state of mild anxiety, uncertain of how this introduction would go. He wondered whether to choose the same sundress or try something less jarring, like a simple blouse and skirt. He worried that maybe it was too soon, that maybe he was imposing this on Leo. But then again, Leo was the one who asked. Saturday arrived. After a light lunch, Leo gave David a small nod, signifying that he was still on board with the plan. Heart thrumming, David retreated to his office, where he kept his small wardrobe. His hands trembled as he took out a soft blouse and a knee-length skirt. He hesitated over the wig, but then decided that if Leo wanted to meet Diane, that included the wig. He slipped on the clothes with methodical care, trying to keep his breathing steady. Then he stood before the mirror, affixing the wig so it rested naturally over his ears and across his shoulders. He picked up a lipstick in a muted rose shade, applying it gently. A little mascara, a little eyeliner, enough to feel comfortable. He took one last look at the mirror. It still surprised him sometimes how simply wearing these things could shift his mood. He felt a bit more relaxed, a sense of tension melting. But his nerves remained high because in just a moment he would step out of the office and show this side of himself openly to Leo. When he opened the door, he saw Leo standing at the far end of the hallway, waiting, arms folded. David swallowed. He took a few steps forward. "Hey," David said, his voice noticeably softer. Leo took a breath, eyes moving over David's outfit. He seemed to be bracing himself for the shock. "Hey," he replied, meeting David's eyes. For a moment, neither spoke. David felt exposed, vulnerable in a way he had never felt before. This was worlds away from being seen accidentally. This was a deliberate unveiling. Leo cleared his throat. "You look different from last time." "I wanted to choose something a little simpler," David said, looking down at the blouse. "I hope that helps." Leo managed a thin smile. "It's okay," he said. I'm okay." They moved to the living room, where David sat carefully on the couch, adjusting his skirt so he didn't wrinkle it. Leo sat in the armchair across from him. David gave a small, self-conscious laugh. "This feels so awkward," he admitted, "but I appreciate that you wanted to do this." Leo nodded. "I just figured I should see what you're like when it's not a surprise." "So, any thoughts?" David asked, attempting levity, though his heart was still in his throat. Leo studied him for a long moment. "You really do look comfortable. Like, there's a calmness about you that I don't see when you're just wearing everyday clothes." David felt an odd mix of gratitude and relief. That's probably the reason I do this." They talked in hesitant bursts, with Leo occasionally asking questions, whether the wig was expensive, if the makeup took a long time, if David ever felt guilty about hiding it so long. David answered as best he could, trying to stay honest without overloading him. At times, they both fell silent, and David sensed that Leo was still trying to decide how he felt about all this. David offered to change back after a short while, so as not to overwhelm Leo. However, Leo surprised him by saying, "You can keep it on if you want. I don't mind." This simple statement nearly brought tears to David's eyes. He nodded. "Thank you," he managed. "Just let me know if it's too much." Leo gave another small nod, staring at the coffee table. "I'm actually okay. It's strange, yeah, but it's not as scary as that first moment." Relief spilled over David. He suggested they watch something mindless on television, partly to break the tension. They ended up turning on an old comedy, the kind they used to watch together on weekend nights. David sat on one side of the couch, Diane in a blouse and skirt, while Leo sat at the other end. Occasionally they laughed at a scene, glancing over at each other in the glow of the screen. It was, in its own way, a moment of cautious bonding, even though neither wanted to openly label it as such. After the show ended, David excused himself to the office, emerging a few minutes later in jeans and a t-shirt, makeup removed, wig placed carefully back in its bag. He rejoined Leo, who seemed relieved to see Dad again, but also not as shaken as he once was. "That was okay?" David asked tentatively. "It was," Leo replied, voice steady. "Weird, but okay." From that day on, the matter of Diane was no longer a forbidden or hushed topic. Leo didn't ask about it constantly, nor did David flaunt it. There were occasional moments when David retreated to the office, locked the door, and emerged an hour or two later looking refreshed. Leo would glance up, notice the improved mood, and give a polite nod as though to say, "I get it." One evening, while they were cleaning up after dinner, Leo admitted quietly, "I told a friend, not the full story, just that I found out something about you that was surprising. My friend was like, 'Well, parents can do weird things sometimes. If it's not hurting anyone, then maybe it's okay.' So that actually helped me think about it differently. Like, you're not doing anything bad." David paused in placing dishes into the dishwasher. He looked over at Leo, an earnest expression on his face. "I'm glad your friend had that reaction," David said, carefully choosing his words. "It's true. I'm not trying to hurt anyone. This is just a part of me that I keep private because it's not always easy for others to understand." They finished tidying up, the warmth between them slowly returning to something more natural. Over the next few weeks, their daily routine stabilized further. They went grocery shopping, joked about current events, and occasionally debated which movies to watch. The memory of that afternoon's discovery lingered between them, but it was no longer an unspoken, menacing shadow. Instead, it became a topic they could gradually broach without hostility. One Saturday, Leo was sprawled on the couch reading a textbook, and David emerged from the office in Diane's attire, as if summoning the nerve to be seen that way in a shared space. He walked to the living room. "Would it bother you if I just read here like this?" Leo looked up. Though there was a hint of surprise in his eyes, he shrugged. "It's your house. Go ahead." David settled into the armchair. At first, they just read in silence, the rustle of pages the only sound. After a while, they began to chat about random things, local news, Leo's classes, the restaurant that opened nearby. Leo even teased David lightly, as he would on any other day. The tension that once prevailed was gradually dissolving. Still, there were moments of raw discomfort for both. One evening, Leo returned from hanging out with a friend and walked into the living room just as David, dressed as Diane, was removing nail polish. Leo froze for a second, an old flash of confusion reappearing, but then he relaxed, took a seat at the table and said, "I'm actually kind of hungry. "Did you eat yet?" David, while finishing with the remover, answered that he'd only made a quick snack. Moments like that, they both realized, marked the slow evolution of their relationship. Once unimaginable, now more normalized. In the midst of all this, David worried about how far the changes might go. Would he eventually become comfortable going out in public? Would that cause problems for Leo? But as the days went by, he realized that the urgent question was not whether or when he might go outside, but how to maintain a stable, loving connection with his son. The rest could wait. One afternoon, David's phone rang. It was his mother, Leo's grandmother, calling from a few hours away. She wanted to come visit for a weekend. The sudden invitation triggered all of David's old anxieties about being discovered. But now he also had another layer to manage. He wondered, if his mother stayed in the house, should he hide everything away? Or did he risk telling her? He decided to confide in Leo. "Your grandma wants to visit," David said over breakfast. "I was thinking about her staying in the guest room for 2 nights. Leo nodded. "Okay, that's good. It's been a while since we've seen her." David raked a hand through his hair. "I'm not sure if I should tell her about Diane. If I don't, I'll have to be extra careful." Leo shrugged, a bit uneasy. "I mean, that's up to you. If it's not going to come out, maybe it's simpler not to mention it." David grimaced. "Yeah, that might be easier. But if she stays here, I won't be able to do any of this. And I'm not sure how that'll affect my mood or stress levels. Plus, it feels dishonest." Leo chewed on a piece of toast. "I guess you have a few days to figure it out. I mean, I didn't handle it perfectly at first, so I can only imagine how she might react." David sighed. "You're right. Let's just see how it goes." The grandmother arrived on Friday afternoon. The house took on a brisk energy as David bustled around, making sure the place was tidy, while Leo took her suitcases. She was a talkative woman in her 60s, silver hair pulled into a neat bun. Over dinner, she asked countless questions about Leo's classes, his plans, and David's job, giving unsolicited advice whenever possible. David found it comforting in some ways, exasperating in others. Throughout her visit, David didn't bring up Diane. He kept the office locked at night, not because he was dressing inside it, but because all of his things were in there. By Sunday morning, after she left, David was exhausted. He realized how draining it was to keep that part of himself under strict wraps for even a couple of days, especially given that it had become more openly acknowledged within his own household. When Leo noticed how on edge his father was, he gave David a thoughtful look. "We can talk about that if you want." David managed a tired smile. "It's okay. I'm just feeling the strain of not being able to unwind the way I'm used to." Leo nodded sympathetically. "You know, maybe you should tell her someday," he said. "I might have freaked out initially, but once I realized you're still you, I got used to it." "Got used to it, huh?" David teased lightly. "I guess that's a victory." Leo smirked. "Yeah, well, it took time." Time continued on as it does, weeks into months. Their relationship found a new normal. They would have arguments about typical father-son stuff, like curfews or chores, but the matter of Diane no longer haunted them as it once did. They had confronted it in their own way, each with fits and starts, confusion, and yes, occasional frustration. However, the bond that held them together as family had strengthened in the face of that vulnerability. One night, David ventured out of his office wearing a dress for the first time in a month. He had chosen that floral sundress, the one Leo had originally seen. The same color, the same cut. As David stood in the living room, turning off lamps and getting ready to settle in, Leo stepped out of his bedroom. They locked eyes. For a second, David thought he saw a trace of the shock from that fateful day, but it vanished quickly. Leo gave him a small nod. "You're wearing that again," he said, his tone neutral. David smoothed the fabric nervously. "Yeah, I guess it's been a while since I've worn it. I thought it might be good to not let the memory of that day ruin it for me. But if it's weird..." "It's not," Leo said, a bit more assertively. "I'm okay." A gentle warmth bloomed in David's chest. He approached the hallway leading to Leo's room. "I appreciate that." They stood awkwardly for a moment, and then Leo cleared his throat. "I'm heading to bed. Got an early class tomorrow. Good night, Dad. Or Diane," he added with a shy, almost playful grin. David felt a wave of relief and even happiness. "Good night," he responded, feeling that, in a small but profound way, they had reclaimed the memory of that dress. The following weekend, David found himself in the backyard, trimming the overgrown hedge, wearing sweatpants and a t-shirt. Leo was inside, likely playing a game on his computer or working through some homework. A neighbor passed by, called out a greeting, and David chatted politely, conscious of how different it would be if the neighbor knew about Diane. But for now, the father and son had their own accord, one that didn't need outside validation. The sky was a brilliant blue, and the mild air carried the fragrance of freshly cut grass. When he finished up outside and returned to the house, he found Leo sitting in the living room, flipping through channels. David dropped onto the couch, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. "Man, that hedge was a monster," he said, trying to catch his breath. Leo laughed. "It was about time. It was creeping over the fence." David settled in, leaning his head back. After a few minutes, he ventured, "I know I've said this before, but I really am proud of you for dealing with all this so maturely." Leo paused, remote in his hand. "I think it's all been a bit of a learning curve. I never realized how complicated people can be, even my own dad. But you're still you, right?" David smiled. "Yes," he said softly. "I'm still me." They didn't need to say more. They understood that their bond was evolving in a way neither of them could have predicted. The initial shock, the silence, the confrontation, it had all led them to a precarious but ultimately deeper understanding. Though the world outside might not see it, within these walls, father and son were forging a path that allowed space for curiosity, compassion, and honesty, even in the face of the unexpected. A few days later, David was in the office, half-dressed in a simple pair of jeans, but still wearing a bit of makeup, having just tried out a new mascara he'd ordered online. Leo knocked on the door, and when invited in, stepped inside with a question about his next semester's schedule. He took in the sight of David's lightly made-up face and didn't even flinch. They talked about classes, credit hours, and time conflicts, as though nothing unusual was happening. Then Leo gave him a quick thanks and was on his way. David realized, as he watched his son go, that something profound had changed. A sense of normality had emerged where panic once lived. On occasion, David felt pangs of anxiety about how others would react if they found out. What if extended family discovered it? What if word spread among Leo's friends? But each time those concerns arose, David reminded himself, the essential thing is that Leo knows, and that he remains comfortable enough to talk about it. The rest can be handled if and when the time comes. In the months that followed, Leo moved a few steps closer to adulthood, juggling more responsibilities. He got a job on campus, began thinking about internships, and occasionally stayed out late with friends, testing the boundaries of living with a parent. David continued his own routines, balancing a busy season at the accounting firm while occasionally slipping into Diane's shoes or skirts when he needed a reprieve from the demands of daily life. Each time Leo came home early or unexpectedly, David felt a brief jolt of alarm, then remembered that he no longer had to scramble to hide. He might change clothes if he felt it was appropriate, but he didn't have to bury that part of himself in shame. The father and son still had their quarrels about the usual things: chores, grades, finances, and rules. But the once overwhelming fear that their relationship would be irrevocably damaged by the discovery of Diane had subsided. They had weathered that storm and found each other on the other side, shaken but still standing. On one particularly quiet evening, David and Leo sat out on the back patio, a small lantern lighting their faces. They could see stars overhead, faint but clear enough. A cool breeze rustled the fence. Leo had come home earlier than expected, and David was in casual men's clothes, just finishing up a phone call. After he hung up, they lapsed into a comfortable silence. Eventually, Leo turned to his father. "You know," he began, "that day I walked in on you was probably the scariest moment I've had in this house." David nodded slowly, exhaling. "I can't say I disagree. It was pretty terrifying for me, too." Leo was silent for a beat. "But it's kind of strange, isn't it? Everything I was afraid of, losing respect for you, thinking you were a completely different person, it didn't happen. Like, I see you differently in some ways, sure, but not in a bad way." David felt his eyes sting. He rested a hand lightly on Leo's shoulder. "That means more than I can say. I was afraid of the same things, that you'd never see me as your dad again, that it would shatter our bond." Leo picked at the edge of his sleeve, looking down at his feet. "It shook me up, but I guess I realized people can have all kinds of sides to them. You were still there, behind that wig, behind the makeup. We still talk, we still argue, but you're still the same person at your core." David couldn't help the wry smile. "You're not going to use this revelation as leverage to get out of taking the trash out, are you?" Leo chuckled. "Might be worth a try sometime, but no, I know you'd still make me do it." "Absolutely," David said, joining in the laugh. They sat there a while longer, quietly taking in the night. David thought about how the house itself felt changed, no longer a fortress of secrets, but a place where father and son could be themselves, complicated and imperfect, yet loving. The gentle sound of the wind rustling through the hedges David had trimmed reminded him of how time continued to move, bringing transformation with it. Eventually, Leo yawned. "I think I'm going to head to bed." David stood, stretching. "I'll lock up." Leo lingered a moment, then gave David a quick hug. It was spontaneous, unplanned. David hugged him back. In that small, simple gesture, all the unspoken gratitude, the acceptance of one another's hidden layers, flooded through them. When Leo pulled away, his eyes were bright, but he offered a casual nod, as if to say, "We're fine. We're good." David watched Leo walk inside, then stared a few moments more at the stars. The wind had died down. He remembered the day he had knelt at the vanity, applying eyeliner, wearing that floral sundress, never suspecting that Leo was about to open the door. The initial shock and fear had felt like a crack ripping through his life. But now, standing here under the starlight, he couldn't deny that beneath that fear had been something else. A hope that if discovered, he would not be cast aside, but could be truly seen and still loved. He turned off the lantern and headed inside. That night, after brushing his teeth, he paused in the hallway in front of Leo's door. Unlike all those nights he had hovered there in dread, this time he simply smiled. Then he went to his own bedroom. He didn't need to lock any doors or hide anything away to find rest. The house was quiet, comfortable, and open. Before drifting off to sleep, David allowed himself a small moment to think about Diane, about the comfort of that floral sundress or the gentle brush of mascara. He pictured the way Leo had started to ask thoughtful questions, the way the tension in the boy's face had started to ease whenever he saw his father dressed differently. Maybe the world would never know Diane, or maybe that would come in some distant future. But for now, father and son had forged a bond deeper than either had believed possible before that door had swung open. And in that new closeness, David felt something that might be described as relief, or maybe quiet gratitude, that the person he cared about most had chosen to keep loving him fully. He turned over, closed his eyes, and let sleep come, secure in the knowledge that even in the wake of their most difficult conversation, they had emerged together, bound by family, trust, and all the messy, beautiful truth that lay between them.
Did you like the story? Hit that like button and tell me what you thought in the comments. Do you want to hear more stories? Subscribe and hit the bell. For exclusive content and early access, check out our Patreon. You can find the link in the description, or you can watch any of the videos shown on my right. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.